like, okay, obviously this guy, you're gonna break up with this guy. Like, thank you for telling me so quickly why. Like, she doesn't even build up to it. She's like, this is why she's gonna break up with him. Just FYI, I'm just letting you know right at the beginning so we don't waste our time on this. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me. Today I'm going to be talking about what I read in February. These are the books that I kind of chose mostly because like February was the month of love and I thought might as well follow the theme. So I do have a couple of more rom-coms or just like romantic fiction that I read outside of the two that I reviewed. If you haven't watched those, I definitely recommend because I tend to rant and I'm pretty funny when I rant, so maybe you'll enjoy those. But anyways, let's begin. I started with Hanakan Carries On, and it is by Uzma Jalaluddin. She is a Canadian author, and her story in this case is a romantic comedy. It's very similar or familiar to You Got Mail or Sleepless in Seattle. If you ever watch those old like late 80s, early 90s rom-com movies with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan. And that's part of what attracted me to this book. So to give a quick summary, Hanakan is a woman who's working at the Toronto radio station. She's interning to become a podcaster, and at the same time she runs her own podcast where she talks about her experiences and topics that interest her as like a Muslim woman in Toronto who wears a hijab. While she's doing these two projects, she's also helping her family run their restaurant, and there's some obvious struggles that come in. If you've watched Sleepless, if you got mail. If you watched You Got Mail, you know that in that movie, Tom Hanks is like the rival that shows up and opens up a bigger bookstore. And that's kind of what happens in the book. There's a rival comes in who opens up another halal restaurant in the same neighborhood that she is. And currently they're the only ones. So it starts like this whole rivalry between the two of them. And while her restaurant is struggling, his is like kind of booming because he knows how to use, marketing strategies, communication strategies to appeal to a younger generation and attract them to the neighborhood. And so there's this rivalry happening between the two of them. Her restaurant is struggling, so a family member from India comes to help, and it's really a lovely book. I really can't recommend it enough. There's a bit of a slow start to it, but it picks up very quickly. There's a lot of topics, like serious topics that she discusses, including like a Muslim identity in Canada, in Toronto. She talks about family bonds and, just women in marriages and women's place in like these two countries. Like she just doesn't, that's one thing I really appreciated, is that she's not just criticizing, what they do in the old country. She's also criticizing how people are treated in the current country that she's living in. It has a very like modern and contemporary feel to it. And by saying that, I mean, although it does take from like Sleepless in Seattle, it doesn't feel like a remake of Sleepless in Seattle. It feels like its own thing that like is inspired or has the same feel to it, but it's very much going its own course, and I really, really can't recommend it enough. I really love the characters. I had many moments when I was reading it and I was laughing out loud because I couldn't help. Like the dynamic was just so quirky and just so funny, and it was naturally funny. It wasn't like, oh yeah, and then Hannah laughed, and it was really because she found this humorous, and you're like, this isn't funny. Like, why is this character laughing? But in the book, you're like, oh yeah, these characters are great, and they have a really great dynamic. The love interest isn't, a jackass, isn't a terrible person that like through circumstances or through just the author writing is turned into a good person at the end, and becomes the love interest. Like, the love interest throughout the book is a decent human being. He's a decent guy, and it's very satisfying when they get together. So, can't recommend it enough. This is Hanakan Carries On. I have a different cover to it because I picked up an arc for it last year and only got around reading to it now. So the one that you'll see will probably, it's bluish and it has her, like a silhouette of her with a mic. So I would definitely, if you're looking for it, that's what you're going to be looking for, not this cover. So definitely pick it up if you can. And support a Canadian author. Come on. The next book that I read was kind of a palate cleanser because I had been reading Hanakan. I had also finished The Duke and I and The Duke Went Down. So I was kind of like, I need something that's not romantic because I'm getting sick of this genre. So I got an arc of After Beowulf by Nicole Markotic. Ooh, that reflection is just not doing us any favors. It's a really nice teal color. As you can see, it's not for sale, so don't get any ideas. It's coming out in April, I believe. And basically, it's just a translation of Beowulf. If you know who the story of Beowulf, then it'll be a very familiar kind of journey that you're going to go on. It's supposed to be a more contemporary translation, so there's allusions to like memes and to jokes and to like there's lingo that's very like 2020. And so if you are somebody who's studying Beowulf as in your undergrad, I would definitely recommend that you pick this up as you're reading through Beowulf. I think it would definitely help you understand it easier if you need that extra help. I enjoyed it just because I enjoy Beowulf. And she was a fun and quirky writer in terms of how she's translating it and what things she's using to highlight in like contemporary culture in the book. The writing is also really good. There's still that old language that comes through, and she has this really funny not tendency, but a little funny like thing she does where when they're talking about the Great Hall of Heorot, which is where he fights Gwendol, which is the big monster that he needs to fight, and that's the whole point of this book, is that he goes and he fights this monster in this hall that basically comes in this hall and eats people. I don't know why I'm telling you this story. I assume that you guys might know because there was a whole film that came out and I think Angelina Jolie was in it. Maybe I should explain what it is. You got it, right? Like, there's a monster, it's attacking this hall, the Hall Heorot, and Heorot? I don't know. And basically eats people alive and then leaves. Beowulf hears about their suffering, comes on over, and decides to fight the monster in the hall. And so he's in Heorot Hall, and the funny thing that Nicole does is that she mentions when the hall is like referred to in the feminine and when it's referred to in the masculine, if anything. And it's just a really interesting perspective in how people use language, especially like a language that genderizes terms, and sometimes they don't and sometimes they do, and how they do it and when they do it in terms of the context of what they're saying. So yeah, it's a really interesting read. I really enjoyed how she translated the book and the things that she kept, or the tale, sorry, and the things that she kept to denote, as I mentioned, like what's female, what's not female. When he fights Gwendol's mother, there's this really interesting section where she includes, I believe it's her own writing, because I haven't read Beowulf in a while, but it's her own writing of what the mother is thinking about, and it's almost like a conversation, a poetic conversation that she's having with Beowulf as they're fighting. It was really, really cool. Definitely recommend it. It's so short, like you have no excuse if you're interested in this kind of thing, obviously. But if you're not, then that's totally okay. And yeah, the next book I read, again, another palate cleanser, was Lesser Known Monsters of the 20th Century by Kim Fu. So these are 12 short stories about just like, they're almost Kafkaesque. That's how they they just summarized it or described it in the back. They range from sci-fi to fantasy. It's just really short stories that really make you think, and it took me a while to read this book because every story, it takes a while for me to absorb and digest in terms of the themes and the things that she's trying to tell you about. One such story, I'll give you a sneak peek, was about this woman who's suffering from like depression. She lives in high rises that are attached to different malls, so she never really goes outside and never really leaves the premises of the malls. And she's seeing a therapist, and her therapist is encouraging her to like make human connections, even if it's just for like a one night stand. So she typically goes to the mall to grab food, and there she has seen multiple times this man who sells these time cubes, and they're basically clear cubes with a dial on them, and inside the first cube that he shows is a flower, and as he adjusts the dial, the flower will age or it will like revert back to its form. And then the next one he brings, or the next one she sees, is a frog, and the same thing happens. It reverts from like a frog, like an aged frog, to an egg, actually not even a tadpole, to an egg, and then back. And so she decides, because this man has been like really interesting to her, to approach him, and she asks him to have a one night stand. And while she's there, she finds that he has a time cube that's the size of a person to get in. And she realizes that he has been aging himself back to maintain his youth and to stay young for as long as possible. So she gets curious about the time cube, and she goes inside, but instead of dialing it back to her youth, she dials it forward to age herself. And she explains like what it feels like to be aging so quickly forward, and she's mentioning it as if like she is still experiencing all like the loss and the happiness and all the feelings that she's going to have as she's aging, but it's happening so quickly because she's using the dial, and her body is also aging. And it was just this really interesting scene of like, oh, this frog is still experiencing its life, but just in like fast forward, and now she's experiencing that, but also in fast forward. And as she's aging herself, the salesman, the time cube salesman, rushes in and calls her by another name. And then it ends. And so this is what I mean when you have to take a moment to digest what you've consumed, because it's like, okay, first we need to unpack what this means about like the things and animals and people that are in these cubes. And then we also have to unpack, the fact that this may not be the first time that she's done this, that she's encountered, like that they've united and then separated again. And like, I felt like a clever retelling of, soulmates, because in this case, they may have been together many times, but she keeps like almost killing herself, because it's a trigger warning, I guess, of suicide I should include. But yeah, like she keeps forcing herself to a point where she gets so old that she forgets who she is, which could be potentially death. And then he would use the dial and revert her back to her youth, and she starts again, but as a different person. And so he keeps aging himself down to like potentially meet her over and over again because he's in love with her. And so that's what I was thinking about, and like just a tragedy that's behind that kind of love. And I was also thinking about like, again, even like she mentions in the short story about the people that would have this kind of power, who would want this kind of power, obviously the wealthy, and like how they would use that for potentially the wrong kind of gains, and like how she understands why he's keeping it secret. And yeah, it's just such an interesting story. And like all of them are like this. They're all like these really interesting short stories that talk about themes and topics that seem to be really straightforward as you're reading them, but then you get to the end and you're like, wait, like what did I just read? And thankfully it's not bad. It's all pretty, like philosophical in the way that they're presented to you. And I would definitely recommend. And it's another Canadian author. These are all Canadian authors, actually. I should call this my Canadian haul. But yeah, definitely recommend Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century. I think it's a really interesting read. And the last book that I read, I have them all here in a pile, was Sorry Not Sorry by Sonia Singh. And this was my last rom-com of the month. This was the hardest book for me to get through. It really was a terribly written book. It was so bad. It's the premise, and what attracted me to it was there's this Indian woman. She's it's like a second generation in the US. Apparently she runs her own successful multi-million-dollar company called Breakup, where she assists people in breaking up with their girlfriends, boyfriends, partners. And she doesn't know too much about her Indian culture because her parents raised her separate from that. One day she gets onto the cover of a magazine and sees that she's been whitewashed, and so she decides to take a moment and actually explore her identity and what it means to her. And I was like, oh, that's actually a really interesting premise. And obviously, like, the rom-com aspect comes in is with the person that she asks for help to explore her Indian identity, which is this guy named Sammy. Her name is Manny. And Sammy, he basically is going to his brother's wedding, and he was trying to hire her services to temporarily break up with his white girlfriend because he, as the older brother, knows that it would be a big dishonor to his family for him to bring a white girlfriend to the wedding when, you know, it's supposed to be about his younger brother and their marriage, and it would just be a lot of drama that he doesn't want to bring to his brother's wedding, which is a fair thing to have. So he asks her to do this temporary breakup. She says no. Instead, they make this agreement that he'll bring her instead under a premise of it being a business deal, so the girlfriend will get suspicious and she'll learn more about her Indian culture through this giant wedding. I don't know how, but regardless, it's a good place to start. So I was behind it. From the summary, I was behind it. And then we jump into the book, and it is the most poorly written book I have read in a long time. And I got a free version, and this is why I am not that upset. But I'm upset because I'm stuck with this book that I can't get rid of. And it's so bad. It really is bad. Just think of any really poorly written tropes, or not even tropes, themes or skills, and she'll hit them. She'll hit every single one of them. She does show and tell. She does both of them in the book. She'll show you what somebody's feeling through a scene, and you're like, okay, I get it. She's a workaholic, and then in the next sentence she'll have the character say, I'm a workaholic, and you're like, I know, you just showed me. Why are you telling me? She has terrible understanding of the business world. I don't even think she did basic research in how a company is run, because she has someone who's her personal assistant, but is also apparently the person who helped co-found her business. So I was like, why is she still your assistant? Especially if she's pitching ideas to you. If she's pitching ideas, she's not your assistant anymore. Why are you, what's happening here? And her CFO is also pitching ideas, and I don't understand that either, because why was a CFO pitching ideas? CFOs are for your finance. They're dealing with money. They're making sure that everything is going correctly with your budgets and stuff like that, and your accounting. Why do they care about pitching ideas to you? If anything, they'd be there giving you the cost analysis or profit loss analysis of these new ideas when somebody is pitching this new idea to you. She's also really too hands-on in her company for somebody, again, who's running a multi-million-dollar company. And that's a really big company. A multi-million-dollar company isn't this mom and pop consultant shop that she's writing her to be. And so you have that aspect of like no understand, like not a grasp of like what how a business is run and how it functions and the players within it and their roles. You also have, again, just like really bad characters. You have a couple of gay characters in this book. They're all male and they're so stereotypically gay, and it's so insulting to read because they're hyper feminine and hyper like active in the way that they talk, and they're all like obsessed with celebrity gossip. They might as well all be the same person. They might as well be just one character because of the way that she writes them. They're the exact same. Like, they're all like, you know, super fashionable and they all know how to dance and all that stuff. And you're like, okay, but... And of course, the pièce de résistance is the fact that like they're all okay with cheating. Because, oh, by the way, she's engaged to a white man also. But honestly, from the very like couple of pages, like she makes it very clear that this guy isn't going to be endgame, because she very quickly, the author states that, oh, you know, Manny just sees their relationship as a business transaction because like they just talk about business all the time that they're together. And you're like, okay, obviously this guy, you're gonna break up with this guy. Like, thank you for telling me so quickly why. Like, she doesn't even build up to it. She's like, this is why she's gonna break up with him. Just FYI, I'm just letting you know right at the beginning so we don't waste our time on this. And I'm like, okay, maybe we're gonna spend time on, you know, exploring your culture a little bit more then. And not really. Like, the only culture is the wedding. And even that she doesn't really unpack in a meaningful way. She really writes it as somebody who's part of the culture, and so who just assumes certain like understandings of the culture because, you know, she grew up with it, and she has. The author has. But Manny hasn't, so you would expect certain like explanations of certain things, but they just don't. They're just like, she has to go do this. Why? Tradition. And you're like, okay, but where did this come from? Like, why is this important? Like, how is this related to this activity? Who knows? Like, just go along for the ride, basically. Of, you know, tourism. Indian culture tourism without, like, really in-depth understanding of why these things are meaningful and important. And she has the time to write this, right? Like, it's a pretty short book. She has the time to unpack these things and really discuss them in a meaningful way. Like, I can't help comparing Sorry Not Sorry or Sorry Not Sorry to Hannah Kind Carries On, because Hannah does unpack all these meaningful themes and topics that affect her as like a second generation woman growing up in Toronto, and again, a Muslim woman who's wearing hijab. Well, like, Manny doesn't, she doesn't spend any time unpacking it. Like, you can't tell me that this woman has never received any kind of, like, passive racism for being a brown woman as she was, like, building up her empire. You can't tell me that, like, she didn't receive from her own people, like, criticisms and prejudices for not knowing about Indian culture and not being Indian enough for them. Because, like, that's what any second generation immigrant feels, or like child of an immigrant feels, is that like they're never enough for their culture, their original motherland culture, like the people who were born and raised there and come and you see them, or you go back to your country and you meet them, and it's never enough. You're never enough. You're always an outsider, and it's never discussed in that manner. And like there is one scene where like a character calls her out on basically plain Indian. And I was like, oh wow, like this is gonna lead to something. It doesn't lead to anything. It was just like a little bit of tension to make her cry as a 31-year-old woman. And I was like, why? Like, why are you crying about what this woman says? Like, you run a successful business. You're constantly probably receiving criticisms and like hateful comments and hateful emails from like the type of business that you run, which is, you know, breaking people up. You can't tell me an angry ex hasn't like emailed you to be like, F you dumb B word. And then this woman just says like, you're not Indian enough for us, and she's there crying. I'm like, I could see it if it's like a long standing like criticism that she's faced, and it's finally like, again, the straw that broke the camel's back, and that's why she like finally unravels. But it's not the case in this book. Like, she's has Indian friends around her. She visits Indian restaurants. She's surrounding herself with Indian people. And she does have some white friends, but they're the gay ones, so, you know, not that they don't count, but that like it's, I feel like it's more there for representation than it is for any actual meaningful relationship that she may or may not have. And that's really the theme of the book, is that it's not meaningful at all. When she finally breaks up with her white fiance, it's after she's cheated on him with Sammy. And you're just like, you're a terrible person. Like, yes, maybe the relationship isn't perfect, and yes, maybe like the relationship needs more communication on like what you both want, but why are you cheating on him before you break up with him? Like, the least you could do is tell him that it's off before you start making out with this guy at his brother's wedding. And the brother himself, the brother, Sammy himself, he has this white girlfriend, and of course, like, you find out, like, you know, she's a cheater. She's trying to separate him from his family because she's encouraging him to pursue his business. He's also running a company. How lucky that they both found each other. He's running his own company, and she's like, you know, pushing him to pursue his own business. And again, it's just like painted with this like really, like, as somebody who's like read a lot of South Asian literature, it's really painted with this like stereotype that South Asian people and men have for white women, which is, you know, that they're floozies, they're a bunch of sluts and they'll sleep around, and also like they have no like family, or like, you know, they don't care about their families at all. And maybe that's the case for some people, but I know a lot of white people who care a lot about their friends and who care a lot about their family, and it may not be like, again, like found family as well, I'll include that, and they are really involved with their family. Like, there's tons of like white people who don't leave their communities because they want to stay with their family and want to stay close to their families. So I don't understand why this is being thrown in and why it's being accused to this white woman. Like, I honestly only finished this book because there was a moment where it felt like she was going to end up with her fiance's brother, Derek. Because they had a moment where they were talking, and like he was obviously like interested in her heritage, and he was asking her about like Indian culture, and she didn't really know how to answer him about it. And he was like, he's really invested in his family. He's always trying to reach out to his brother, but his brother is busy with work, but he still comes, even though he's busy with his own job, to come and visit his family, his parents, and all that stuff. And you're like, oh, like here they have shared values. Like, maybe the two Indian people aren't going to hook up. Maybe she's going to end up with this brother, and she's going to help Sammy like transition his family into accepting the fact that he has a white girlfriend, and, you know, we're all going to be hunky-dory friends. And so that's why I continued it, because I thought, oh, maybe this is where it's going to lead. Nah. They keep mentioning this like Derek character, that her fiance's brother, to no avail. It's just to be like, yeah, he's a famous person, and she knows famous people, like, look how cool she is. And I'm like, wow, what a waste of my time. Like, I don't care. Like, how is this relevant in any way, shape, or form to the story, or to like her character development? It has no point to it. And yeah, I was really disappointed reading this. I just couldn't believe how poorly written it was. Like, it's like somebody, it didn't even go to an editor to make sure that it made sense, and that there was no grammar. I don't even know how to speak, apparently. There were no grammar like, there is no vocabulary mistakes, but there's like structural problems, there's like character problems, and it's all very contrived, and it just feels like it was like someone to check off a box. Like, this person is like an entertainment journalist, so it just feels like she knows somebody in the industry who's like, oh, we need to, you know, there's an interest for more diverse voices. What do you think about writing a book? And she was like, yeah, I've always wanted to do that. And she wrote this book in like a couple of months, and then she just gave it to her friend, and her friend was like, good to go. And there's nothing else to this other than that. And there are so many other voices of people of color, of Indian writers in Canada, in the US, that you can like publish and you can like give a spot to. But because they don't have like an audience like this person probably has. Like she's a journalist, so people obviously know her, and an entertainment journalist at that. Like she probably has a ton of Twitter followers. I didn't look into it. I'm sorry if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. Like Hannah Khan, her the author, she from what I can tell, and from what I can see, like she's not in any kind of like big show business, or she's not involved in like the media in any way, shape, or form. She wrote a really great book, and I was like, I would really appreciate it if like she got more than half the attention that this book may get. So again, please get Hannah Khan Carries On if you like romantic comedies. It's a really great book. I really can't recommend it enough. I'm gonna end it there because I don't want to keep ranting, and it's just gonna make me upset. So thank you all very, very much for coming and listening to me rant about what I read in February. It is March right now. So I hope to see you next time, and I hope you have a lovely day wherever you are. Take care, everyone.